In 2003, Doctor Who fan site Outpost Gallifrey held a poll ranking every Doctor Who story to celebrate the show's then 40th anniversary. Sitting at number 1 was 1977's The Talons of Weng-Chiang, and honestly, nobody was that surprised. The story represented everything fans loved about the Philip Hinchcliffe era, a period still regarded by many as Doctor Who's golden age. But over time, discussion around Talons began to change, not because opinions on the story's quality shifted, but because modern audiences began to re-evaluate its racial stereotyping and representation through a very different cultural lens. So let's take a look at the Talons of Weng-Chiang and ask, is this the most divisive Doctor Who story ever? The Talons of Weng-Chiang was originally broadcast in 1977. Not only is the final story of season 14, but also the final story produced by Philip Hinchcliffe. Despite a string of highly acclaimed stories and strong viewing figures, the era's increasing levels of violence and horror had attracted criticism from campaign of Mary Whitehouse and the National Viewers and Listeners Association. The controversy eventually led the BBC to move Hinchcliffe onto the more adult-orientated police drama Target, while incoming producer Graham Williams was tasked with lightening the tone of Doctor Who. With these changes already decided before the end of season 14, the production team seemed determined to go out with a bang. Long-serving director David Maloney was brought in, while script editor Robert Holmes adapted elements from a story submission by writer Robert Banks Stewart entitled The Foe from the Future into what would eventually become The Talons of Weng-Chiang. All the ingredients that have made Tom Baker's first 3 seasons such a success are present here. Gothic horror, Victorian penny dreadfuls, and classic Hollywood influences combine as the Doctor and Leela arrive in Victorian London and uncover a mystery involving disappearing women, giant rats, theatre performers, and a murderous criminal from the future posing as a Chinese god in order to survive long enough to return to his own time. And along the way came enough violence, death, and nightmare imagery to send Mary Whitehouse up the wall as the Hinchcliffe era made one final attempt to leave audiences terrified. The Talons of Weng-Chiang is rich in quality in virtually every aspect of its storytelling. As a writer, Robert Holmes had an extraordinary ability to create imaginative characters and fill their dialogue with wit, personality, and intelligence. Tom Baker is clearly enjoying himself here as a Doctor as he channels his inner Sherlock Holmes, not just in appearance, but in his methods. Investigating the disappearance of young women across the dark corners of Victorian London, the Doctor carefully pieces together the mystery while outsmarting his enemies, keeping his cards close to his chest, and gradually exposing supposedly supernatural events through logic and deduction. The influence of Arthur Conan Doyle's character is certainly impossible to miss. Meanwhile, Leela, in only her 3rd appearance, continues the Eliza Doolittle approach originally envisioned for the character. The Doctor brings her to Victorian London, partly to expose her to the culture and sophistication of her ancestors, far removed from her savage upbringing. Yet, despite dressing for the period and embracing activities like attending the theatre, Leela's warrior instincts never disappear. Her fearlessness repeatedly proves essential as she saves the Doctor's life, pursues the villains herself, and nearly becomes victim to both the story's villains and the giant rats lurking beneath London sewers. Holmes also loved writing double acts, and The Talons of Weng-Chiang arguably contains the greatest example in Doctor Who history, Jago and Lightfoot. Henry Jago is the loud, theatrical owner of the Palace Theatre, unknowingly allowing his premises to be used by the villains as a base of operations. Professor George Lightfoot, meanwhile, is the intelligent and reserved pathologist whose scientific expertise helps the Doctor uncover the truth behind the murders. The chemistry between the pair is so strong that it's easy to forget that they don't actually meet until episode 5. Every Doctor Who story needs memorable villains, and The Talons of Weng-Chiang delivers them in abundance. Firstly, there is Lee San Chang, a mysterious stage magician and hypnotist who performs at the Palace Theatre with abilities seemingly beyond the understanding of the time period. Secretly serving the supposed Chinese god Weng-Chiang, Chang uses hypnotism to lose vulnerable women to his master. But Weng-Chiang is no god at all. He's actually Magnus Greel, a fugitive criminal from the 51st century whose flawed time travel experiments have left his body hideously damaged. Forced to drain the life essence from the others in order to survive, Greel hides beneath Victorian London whilst desperately searching for his long-lost time cabinet. It is Greel's own greed and desperation that makes him such an effective villain, a man destroyed by his own ambition. And acting as his enforcer is perhaps the story's most bizarre creation, Mr. Sin, a murderous robotic assassin that's actually powered by the brain of a pig and disguised as a ventriloquist dummy that's used during Chang's stage performances. Like much of the Philip Hinchcliffe era, the Talons of Weng-Chiang draws heavily from classic literature and cinema. As previously mentioned, the Sherlock Holmes influences are obvious, but the serial also borrows from the stories of Fu Manchu, the Phantom of the Opera, and even elements of Dracula, with the Doctor himself comparing Greel's behaviour to vampirism. Holmes also incorporates real-world inspiration through parallels to the crimes of Jack the Ripper, particularly through the East End setting and the disappearance of vulnerable women. All of this creates an extraordinary sense of atmosphere, elevated further by the story's extensive location filming. Much of the production was shot in the London Docklands, among genuine 19th century architecture, and often filmed at night to maximise that Gothic mood. Even more unusually for Doctor Who at the time, many interior scenes were filmed on location rather than in traditional BBC studios. Certain locations in Northampton doubled for the Palace Theatre, Whitefoot's mortuary, and the police station, giving the serial a cinematic quality far closer to a period drama than the family tea time television programme. So, on the surface, it is easy to understand why the Talons of Weng-Chiang is so often regarded as one of the greatest Doctor Who stories ever made. Strong writing, unforgettable characters, literary influences, and immersive atmosphere all combine to create something genuinely special. But as the years passed, discussions surrounding the story increasingly shifted away from its strengths and towards its controversy. So now we come to the aspect of the Talons of Wen-Chiang that has increasingly shaped modern discussion surrounding the story, its racial representation. As attitudes towards race and representation in television have evolved over the decades, many elements of the serial that had passed largely without comment in 1977 are now viewed very differently by modern audiences. One of the most commonly criticised aspects of the story is the casual use of racially insensitive language throughout the script. Several characters use terminology and descriptions towards Chinese characters that would now be considered offensive, including language historically associated with racial stereotypes and discrimination. Even background details, such as the naming of one of Greel's henchmen in the production credits, reflect terminology that today carries negative racial connotations. The serial also leans into broader stereotypes associated with Victorian era depictions of Chinese communities, including references to opium use and the portrayal of Limehouse as an exotic and dangerous underworld hidden beneath London society. With these elements drawn heavily from Victorian literature and pulp fiction, modern viewers often see them as reinforcing outdated and harmful stereotypes. Lee Sen-Chang himself is also subjected to racially charged comments throughout the story. Certain lines directed towards him, in particular the term celestial, used by Jago as a depiction of Chinese characters as mysterious or other, contribute to the sense of Orientalism that critics often associate with the serial. Even dialogue intended as humour, such as Chang's remark that "we all look the same," can feel uncomfortable to contemporary audiences. However, the most significant criticism surrounding the Talons of Wen-Chiang concerns the casting of Lee Seng-Chang himself. Despite the character being Chinese, the role was played by Caucasian actor John Bennett, using makeup and prosthetics to alter his appearance, a practice now widely recognised as yellowface. Whilst many fans and critics actually continue to praise Bennett's performance itself, debate remains over whether the production ever seriously considered casting an Asian actor in the role, or whether authenticity and representation was simply not viewed as a priority within British television production at the time. The portrayal of Chang also ties directly into one of the serial's most major influences, the Fu Manchu stories created by Sax Rohmer in 1913. The character of Fu Manchu was heavily shaped by early 20th century fears and stereotypes surrounding Chinese people, often referred to as yellow peril fiction, in which Asian characters were depicted as mysterious, sinister threats to Western society. Many visual and thematic elements associated with Li Sanchang and the world of Talons clearly draw inspiration from this genre. It is also worth noting that concerns surrounding the story's racial representation are not purely modern reactions. Criticism emerged relatively early in North America, with the serial reportedly removed from syndication by TV Ontario in 1980 and later withheld from broadcast in parts of Los Angeles during the 1980s. As conversations surrounding race and representation in television have continued to evolve, the controversy surrounding the Talons of Weng-Chiang has become increasingly prominent. Today, many streaming services and releases include viewer discretion warnings, acknowledging the presence of outdated racial depictions and language. One aspect of the Talons of Weng-Chiang that is sometimes overlooked is the use of insensitive language in the script that is not exclusively directed towards Chinese characters. Other ethnic groups and physical characteristics are also described using terminology that would now be considered offensive or outdated. So why does this kind of language appear so frequently throughout the story? Part of the answer lies within Robert Holmes himself. Holmes was renowned for his rich dialogue, eccentric characters, dark humour, and heavily researched period settings. His scripts often attempted to immerse viewers within the attitudes and language of the historical worlds they depicted, and in the case of Victorian London, that included social prejudices and terminology that modern audiences would now find deeply uncomfortable. There is also the argument that Holmes was attempting to reflect Victorian attitudes towards foreigners and minority groups, particularly within the East End setting that inspired much of the serial's atmosphere. However, understanding the influences behind the story does not necessarily remove the discomfort modern audiences may feel when watching it today. To fully understand, though, why the content attracted relatively little controversy in 1977, it is important to look at the wider landscape of British television at the time. Programmes that would now be heavily criticised for racial stereotyping or insensitive representation were often broadcast on mainstream television with little public backlash. Shows such as Love Thy Neighbour, Mind Your Language, and It Ain't Half Hot Mum repeatedly relied on racial stereotypes, exaggerated accents, or ethnic caricatures as part of their comedy. Meanwhile, programmes like the Black and White Minstrel Show still featured performers in blackface well into the 1970s. The point is not that these portrayals were acceptable, but that British television operated within very different cultural standards at the time. Compared to some of the other programmes of the era, The Talons of Weng-Chiang was not viewed by many contemporary audiences as unusually controversial. Nor was The Talons of Weng-Chiang an entirely isolated case within Doctor Who itself. Earlier stories also contained depictions and language that modern audiences have re-evaluated over time. The Tomb of the Cybermen has drawn criticism from the portrayal of Toberman, while Marco Polo and the Abominable Snowmen both feature Caucasian actors portraying Asian characters. Even The Celestial Toymaker has attracted retrospective criticism for imagery and terminology that modern audiences interpret differently today. Ultimately, it is difficult to separate the Talons of Weng-Chiang from racial stereotypes and outdated representation presented within the story. At the same time, it is equally important to recognise that the serial emerged from a wider TV culture in which these portrayals were far more commonplace than they would be considered today. In many ways, The Talons of Weng-Chiang has become a reflection not just of 1970s Doctor Who, but how dramatically audience expectations surrounding representation in television have changed over the decades. Where does that leave The Talons of Weng-Chiang today? In my personal opinion, it remains one of the greatest Doctor Who stories ever produced. The writing, atmosphere, performances, characters, and ambition behind the serial are still remarkable nearly 50 years later. At the same time, it is impossible to ignore the racial stereotyping and outdated representation present throughout the story. Modern audiences are entirely justified in feeling uncomfortable with aspects of the Talons of Weng-Chiang, and for some viewers, those elements may understandably overshadow the serial's strengths altogether. I also do not believe that watching or enjoying the Talons of Weng-Chiang automatically reflects the views of the audience themselves. Appreciating the craftsmanship of a piece of television is not the same thing as endorsing every aspect of its content. Equally, if someone chooses to avoid the story because they find its racial depictions upsetting or offensive, that reaction is completely understandable too. Television has changed enormously since 1977. If The Talons of Weng-Chiang was produced today, its approach to race and representation would undoubtedly be very different. Modern Doctor Who would almost certainly position the Doctor more directly as more of a moral voice against prejudice, something that's notably absent from The Talons of Weng-Chiang itself. So, should the story be banned or removed from circulation altogether? Personally, I don't think so. Nor do I believe heavily editing the serial would necessarily solve the issue either, particularly when so much of the problematic material is entwined with the story's wider themes, influences, and setting. In many ways, the existing content warnings attached to the modern releases and streaming services provide the necessary context for contemporary audiences. Personally, I believe The Talons of Weng-Chiang is best viewed as both a masterpiece of classic Doctor Who and a reflection of the television culture that produced it. Its achievements deserve to be recognised, while its problems should neither be ignored or excused. But ultimately, The Talons of Weng-Chiang endures not simply because it's controversial, but because it forces audiences to confront an uncomfortable truth that great art and deeply outdated ideas can sometimes exist side by side, even if it was never designed to convey that message. And perhaps that is why, nearly 50 years later, it remains one of Doctor Who's most divisive stories ever produced. But tell me, what do you think? Should the Talons of Weng-Chiang still be celebrated as one of Doctor Who's greatest stories, or should it be condemned because of its racial content? Or maybe serve as a reminder as to how television used to be? Let me know in the comments below. But for now, it's the end. The moment has been prepared for.